So as you know, we have a different agenda for today. And here is our plan. We have Deborah Satz on a video. She's in London at the moment giving a talk. And then I'll say a few words about critical thinking and critical discourse. And then we have a panel, and they'll introduce themselves, who are going to show and discuss some highlights from the conversations you've had so far. And then, well, we'll stop there, but then it's your turn to actually do some work. So can we put Deborah on?
Has really had a goal of highlighting the role of disagreement in a democracy, and in particular, the importance of informed debate by among people who disagree. So I want to talk a little bit about why there's disagreement in a democracy. And actually, it's a positive feature of democracies, and not a bug, that there's lots of disagreement, because you only get agreement when you have suppression of alternative ways of thinking. Reasonable people with evidence will still, nonetheless, often disagree. And the course has had the aim of modeling what comes out of, first of all, why people disagree, but also what we learn from those disagreements. Because again, one thing that's really great about democracy is it amalgamates different perspectives. So from an epistemological point of view of creating knowledge, it's much better at creating knowledge than a top-down system that goes one way and suppresses perspectives and information that's needed to guide society and to actually attend to social problems. And I don't think our democracy has been doing a very good job at modeling informed, evidence-based disagreement. I don't think we're doing a great job in education. I don't, in K-12 education. I don't think we're doing a great job in our politics, in our political leadership. I don't think we do a great job in our companies. So there's really an importance to work this muscle, which is so important for democracy. And just to say a little bit about why people disagree. First of all, the facts. Even when we are clear about the facts, they're often incomplete. We often only have a part of a picture. And again, that's why bringing people together in a democracy is so important, because people bring different aspects of reality together and learn from one another. So sometimes we just have an incomplete picture. Sometimes even after we've brought things together, our picture is still incomplete. So there's room there for disagreement. There's also, sometimes the facts are open to multiple interpretations. So sometimes they're underdetermined what you should think. And I'll say more about that in a second, because even when we agree on the facts, and even when we interpret them in the same way, people have different values that motivate them and make different trade-offs. And so even people seeing the same facts might view the costs and benefits of different policies that respond to those facts quite differently. And then, as I say, I think the learning and education that democracy provides depends on, just like the university, depends on many perspectives and voices, and being sensitive to reason and argument and evidence. And that's what the class has been modeling. And I think it's been a delight to watch our faculty and scholars come together and have respectful debates, and have our students in the audience ask very hard questions, And the aim hasn't been in particular to convince everybody of one point of view, but to get people to think. And often you'll come out of it maybe with your view simply, feel more confident in your view and maybe have a deeper understanding, but you'll also be more confident in your view because you have a deeper understanding of the objections to your view. And that's something John Stuart Mill noted a long time ago, that, as he said, teachers and students alike fall asleep at the wheel when there is no enemy in the field, like when you're not confronting difficult ideas and challenges. So that's been the aim of the course, and it's been a delight, and I look forward to its next iteration.
So what are you going to come out, for those of you who are students, and it's nice to have some people who are not students here as well, but what can you gain in college? You certainly get knowledge, and this is an example of history, the knowledge of history. For those of us who are law students or law teachers, the knowledge of legal cases. So that's one thing you get. Another is you get some skills. My bet is that many of the students here have learned to program, and quite a few of you have learned to improve your writing skills. But there's one skill in particular that I want to focus on, and that is critical thinking. So it's worth actually my reading through this nice quote from Derek Bok. Derek Bok was a law professor and president of Harvard University. He said, "Merely accumulating information is of little value to students. Facts are soon forgotten, and the sheer volume of information has grown to the point that it's impossible to cover all the important material or even agree on what's most essential. Concepts and theories have little value unless one can apply them to new situations. The ability to think critically, to ask pertinent questions, recognize and refine problems, identify arguments on all sides of an issue, search for and use relevant data, and arrive in the end at a carefully reasoned judgment. That's what's indispensable means of making effective use of information and knowledge, whether for practice or purely speculative purposes." So how does that relate to this course? John Dewey talked about what the fundamentals of critical inquiry are: the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. So you can engage in critical inquiry all by yourself, and you have to a large extent. You're preparing to write a paper, or reading a paper, or studying something, and you're all by yourself, and you are thinking it through. The Socratic dialogue is critical inquiry with one person being the teacher. In this case, there's one student, but of course, in the law school classroom, it could be one teacher and many students. And that's another way of getting the students to engage in critical inquiry. But what we focused on in this class is critical inquiry through critical discourse, through dialogue with peers. And for 8 of the 10 sessions, you have seen people engaged in dialogue with their peers. As I went through the Lara framework, which we gave you in its unedited form some time ago, it seemed to me that it was worth modifying some. So the first part, and these are all essential aspects of critical discourse. The most important part is be curious about other people's viewpoints, listen actively, don't interrupt. The good practice is pause a moment before speaking. And we'll look at the video clips and see to what extent you see some of these guidelines implemented. What's missing, I realized from the Lara framework, is the Lara framework is all about the interaction. But there's an important thing that happens after you've listened, which is you process things yourself. Even when you're engaged in discourse, you then think yourself, what have I learned from that? And these are a number of guidelines for when you're processing, having heard something from the person you're talking to. Suspending judgment, humility, being not not being sure that your viewpoint, which differs from the other person's viewpoint, is right. Evidence-based reasoning, critical thinking we talked about. Something we didn't, that's worth making explicit, is the difference between a straw man and a steel man approach to argumentation. So if I'm arguing with one of my colleagues on the panel, there's a tendency to hear them and then to make the weakest case for their argument possible and then demolish it. What's called the steelman argument does just the opposite. It makes the strongest case for their argument, for their position, and then I interrogate it and try, if I believe it's wrong, to show why it's wrong. The steelman position, I suppose one could say steel person, but that doesn't quite sound right, is a really important aspect of discourse because it allows you to engage with the person you're talking to rather than engage with your own image of the person you're talking to. So you process what you've heard, then affirming and clarifying to make sure that you understood what you've heard, check your understanding, look for common ground. You know, something that came through so strongly in a couple of the videos, and maybe we'll see some of those today, is when the discussants talk about where they agree as well as they disagree. And then how do you respond in the end, right? Using I statements and, you know, rather than simply asserting something, saying I think or I believe, is a way of making sure the other person is more likely to respond, justifying positions, acknowledging counter-arguments, and the like. The goal is to engage in conversation rather than debate. In debate, you're trying to score points, and that's a perfectly valid way to engage in discourse for some purposes. In our conversation, we're actually trying to understand each other, and that's just a different point of view. So we're going to stop here. Let me ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then, Grandma, you're going to cue up some videos. We can just begin here and go down the line.
Yes. Hello. My name is John Puri. I am a sophomore studying political science.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lexi Cooper, and I'm a junior studying history.
Hi, I'm Senkai Shah, and I am a senior studying mechanical engineering and international relations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Figueroa. I'm a freshman studying history.
And now what we're going to do, Graham is going to cue some videos, little clips, and then the panel will discuss them.
Imagine what would the student body look like if the goal of the admissions process was not to try to admit the highest achievers, right, at an early age, but was instead to try to admit 100% the students for whom the university could make the most difference in their lives. Completely different model. And I know Dusty agrees with this because I've heard Dusty say this before. Right? We're agreeing with that.
I'll quibble with it. So I think
He's disagreeing with himself.
I'm disagreeing with myself. I'm like the future speaker. So I do think that consideration of the impact of coming here should be a factor. And I certainly like it more than a lot of factors we have. But I think a fear I have as we tinker with these things is I think these universities, as powerful ladders of social mobility, are that way partially because they are a place of the elite. And I do think we need a critical mass of people here for it to have that transformative impact. Because these elite people who you're in school with do control all sorts of things about society. And you having relationships with them and networking with them is part of how this transformative impact can happen. And so I think one of the tough things for me, and I think legacy's easier, but I think one of the tough things is as we think about being stewards of the place and stewards of that ladder of mobility, is I do think we need to maintain a critical mass of that eliteness in order to be an effective ladder.
Over to you.
All right. Well, the crux of this question is, as I understand it, they are debating whether or not universities have a vested interest in cultivating their student bodies and on what measures students should be admitted. Now, legacy admissions is controversial because it is a deviation from pure merit as we understand it. It's not just looking at the best test scores, it's not just looking at the best grades, but it's considering something that is immutable, that cannot be changed. You are rewarding children for the accomplishments of their parents. Now, whether or not, now they go into this question of, well, does legacy admissions help the elite or not? And the disagreement seems to be, on one hand, that if you sacrifice merit, then you are going to make the school less elite. On the other hand, if you have the children of people who are already elite, that could be a pretty good benefit in itself.
And
Yeah.
let's talk also about what you're learning from the nature of their discourse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea that stuck out to me the most in this video is the importance of that phrase, disagreeing with yourself, both in terms of clarifying where there are circumstances where the views you previously stated might not apply, and also being explicit about the places where you might have changed your mind. And I think, in fact, you sort of have an obligation to explain places where your views might have changed, since that likely means there was some argument or information that was capable of changing you, moving you closer from one side to another, and it's likely information that would be beneficial to everyone else to hear as well.
What I like from that clip and from what I remember from that discussion, in terms of the Laura framework, the affirmation, there was actually a lot of agreement. The question was whether or not fully the ends justify the means. And what we discovered is that that answer depends on very much of where that you sit, whether or not you're the university or an individual student or an alumni.
Yeah, so I think I'll just add on to what was essentially said in terms of the agreement. One thing that stood out to me was the I believe, I think statements, and alluding to the presentation, how those are important to just move the conversation forward and not necessarily be in a debate with each other, but agreeing with each other and disagreeing in terms of a conversation.
Great. Should we show another clip?
You could actually make that at least neutral. So you could remove lots of obstacles. I've often thought we should have a contest between Stanford and Berkeley and see if we can get a competitive spirit about blood donation, plasma donation, maybe kidney donation. I don't think it would be that successful, but it's worth probably trying. We could do what other countries have done, which is change the default of whether it's an opt-in to be a donator or an opt-out to be a donator, with the idea of trying to set the default as you're a donator. How much that would increase supply, I don't know. I know some of the data suggests not that much, but I still have my worries about the slippery slope.
Well, I share some of your worries about the slippery slope. But I think a better analogy for kidney donors is not soldiers and the obligation to defend your country, but firemen, firefighters. We have volunteer firefighters in the U.S. Many small towns have volunteer firefighters, and they're sufficient for small towns. But for densely populated areas where people's lives will be at risk when there's a fire, we pay and train firemen. We make sure they're prepared. And I think that's not a bad analogy for what we're talking about with donation.
I think one thing that just stood out to me with that conversation was just how respectful it was, despite some of the disagreement in terms of what type of analogy are you going to use. I think the recognition from both individuals that while their stances may not be perfect, they still believe that it's the best option out of both options. And I think not only recognizing that and not really standing too firm on your ground, just contributed to just a very eloquent and respectful conversation between both individuals.
What I appreciated most was when Professor Roth, the first thing he said was, I share your concerns. He acknowledges Dean Satz's moral sort of objections and worries, but then says, this is how I view it instead, and here's how I make those trade-offs differently. And that's very much a more sort of subjective view as opposed to sort of being absolute.
That's something that stuck out to me as well. I also really liked the way he framed his comparison, where he recognized that an argument that might work really well in one circumstance, the example he uses is volunteer fighter fighters in a small town, might not be as suitable in another context. He compares that to like paid firefighters in a large city, but he doesn't use that to say that one is, like you said, objectively better than another, or always wrong or always correct, but rather that the change in condition means that the change in the best argument for that context changes as well.
And he's directly addressing the concern. Professor Satz brought up the slippery slope argument, saying, even if there are these benefits that you speak of, there are serious risks associated with this issue. And he addresses that head on. He says, yeah, as was mentioned, I don't deny that there are risks, but life is full of risk. Everything we do exists on a slippery slope. Taxation can become confiscation, and police can become Gestapo. But some things that we do, regardless of the risk, are worth the cost. So I think he's really hitting her concern, addressing it without denying her premises.
Great, thank you.
Thinking of your body as a set of assets that could be used by society in various ways. And that's the idea of there's a prophylactic line. Now, I think lots of societies draw that kind of line around the body. I don't think it's only a Western idea, but it may be more, kind of a liberal idea because it's very tied to the sanctity of the individual. Again, I have Al in my head saying, but what about the sanctity of the individual who's dying? And what about their body? And so drawing the line around the body in the way I'm proposing has consequences for somebody else's body. And I see that. I just worry about weakening that boundary and in such a way that people then feel pressure. The way you feel pressure when you have an option, and if you close off the option, you're not subject to that kind of pressure anymore. Like, I don't have to think about it. I mean, it's the reason we think closing off some options can sometimes make everybody better off. In this case, it doesn't make everybody better off because the person who's dying and needs an organ is not made better off, but it might be other people are made worse off by giving them the option, and that is a worry.
On the other hand, you can also be coerced without money. If you go home for Thanksgiving and your sister needs a kidney and your mom thinks you should give your sister a kidney, you may be coerced. And it might be better if you could buy her a kidney.
I remember this because I think it was me who asked the question. And what I really appreciated was Dean Satz's very direct response being that, no, the sanctity of the body, pain, these are not sort of Western liberal concepts. These are probably things that everybody can appreciate no matter where they come from. And just a quick plug for her book, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale. It's really, really good, which develops this argument about sort of moral noxiousness a lot further.
Yeah, I really liked Dean Satz's style of discussion in this clip. It seems like she's almost like anticipating before she receives a response what places the professor might disagree with her, and I think that shows like a consciousness that she's thought about the differences in their arguments and also wants to be able to incorporate the places where they disagree into her own conclusions and scenarios.
She's also tremendously quick to acknowledge when he made a good point, right? I mean, she brings up this very legitimate concern of coercion, right? And mentioned this liberal tradition. Even John Locke, the father of liberalism, believed that some things that you can do to yourself are against the law of nature. He didn't believe that you could legitimately kill yourself, for instance. So she's bringing up this very legitimate concern that has roots in political philosophy. And he makes a good point. He says, well, there is already coercion at play within the legal, market for kidneys in which money is not involved. And she is, all to her credit, very gracious in admitting that is correct.
So for me, something that was pretty major out of this conversation was just I feel like the large amount of empathy within the disagreement. Specifically the moment where there was a lot of concern, using words like "I worry if this were to happen," or "if we were to go down this slippery slope, this is a major concern," instead of just disagreeing with the counterpoint and saying that that is incorrect, and that these are the reasons why that's incorrect, and this is why my point is sort of true. I think from the approach of agreeing in an empathetic way, I think was pretty notable.
Remember back in 1871 when the Texas law that we were debating first was adopted, there was some debate, and indeed Bruin cited the claim that black Texans would be better off if they were given guns to protect themselves. Instead, the black senators and House representatives in Texas decided they would be better if guns were taken away. So they were making that empirical assessment, but without the benefit of some of the information we have today.
Yeah, so I agree with much of what John is saying about the methodological points. I do think that in a country of 330 million people, you can find an anecdote for everything. And I also certainly agree that anybody who thinks if I only carry a gun, I will be perfectly safe is a fool. I'm not sure how many people actually think that, because most of us, by the time we become adults, realize nothing will make us perfectly safe. In fact, nothing will make us perfectly anything. That most of the things we do, we put on a seatbelt, does it guarantee that it will save our lives? No, of course not. And anybody who thinks that is likewise foolish. Likewise, anybody who thinks, and I'm sure John will agree with me, that if we just ban concealed gun carrying, then the consequence will be that people will no longer commit crimes with concealed guns because they won't be carrying concealed guns. That can't be right, because we know for every law some people disobey the law. So with that, I generally agree.
Yeah. He started the answer by saying, or his response by saying, I agree with much of that, but let's get to the point. Let's get to the crux of our disagreement. I think that is a role model, because in politics today too often, we get in our trenches and we say, if I believe that this person is wrong, or I disagree with them on the crux of the matter, then I have to fight them on every point. I have to dispute every source they cite. I can't let them get a single point in without being refuted in some way. And this is not how this conversation goes. He says, I agree, I acknowledge, I accept many of your premises, but here's one point upon which we disagree, and that's what I'm interested in talking about. It's not warfare for the sake of it, it's constructive.
I think I broadly agree with that, but I also think that I probably wouldn't have used the word foolish, I think, in that particular context. And the reason why, going back to the framework, is that I think a really important context for these kind of discussions is to make sure that you affirm the dignity of the other person. And so, in addition, what I appreciate is here's where I agree. I wouldn't necessarily use that particular phrase as here's the counterpoint, and therefore everybody who thinks this is somehow sort of empirically wrong or doesn't have the capacity to be able to change their view.
That stuck out to me as well. I guess, to use what John brought up, I agree with much of that. Although I think what sets this example apart, because the first time I listened to this, I was also a little bit alarmed at the word foolish and wondering whether we were stepping past the territory of respectful disagreement into personal criticisms. But I think what the speaker does well is not aiming that word specifically or his general argument at questioning the intelligence or personal character and legitimacy of the first speaker, but rather using these scenarios, like the seatbelt example that I think was effective for me, to point out these potential logical errors that it seems like he's trying to communicate are made by most individuals collectively and not just people on one side of a debate. I think after I heard that word, the next thing that stuck out to me was his consistent use of us, we would be foolish. We use seatbelts, but we know that we're not completely safe every time we step into a car. And I think that point of view, rather than directing it at particularly, you are foolish, you shouldn't use a seatbelt, I think that for me made it an acceptable use of that style of argument. But I also agree with your concern.
Yeah, I just want to echo the concerns that, yeah, when I first watched it, I think using the term foolish, I would not, probably agree that, that is the most respectful, that contributes to the most respectful forms of discourse. But I do recognize that, both did disagree, and they did it, I feel like they handled it for the most part pretty well. I don't think that the speaker directed the word foolish at a specific individual, but just more of like the general, like you mentioned, if you agree in this sense, or if you believe that this is true or this is false, then you are foolish. And I don't know if that would have been, yeah.
Well, one moment, because he wasn't saying. Not only did he not say you, sir, are foolish. He didn't even say that his argument was foolish. He was saying that the extreme of, let's say, kind of a caricature of the speaker's own argument would be foolish. He said he's on the pro, let's say, or the anti-gun regulation side. He's saying, of course, it would be absurd for me to say that, if you have a gun, you're perfectly safe. But that is not what I am saying. I am saying, I am making a much more limited argument than that. So he's calling not even his opponent's argument foolish. He's calling the extreme caricature of his argument foolish. I don't think that's objectionable.
Right. I do think there are some, better and more respectful ways to go about that disagreement.
Well, maybe so, but in that case, he might be disrespecting his own argument. He's not disrespecting the opposition.
Yeah, I do agree that I think he reasonably separates what he's calling this extreme example of the argument and both what he believes and what he believes his colleague to be arguing, which are not the same thing.
Great. And another clip.
Living liver donation, which is more dangerous. Okay, so we do a lot less of it because it's more dangerous. Also because we can't keep liver patients alive as long. There's no liver dialysis. But people give livers. And speaking of agency, there are people who having given a kidney and recovered, which they do pretty promptly, go on to give a lobe of their liver. And you give a lobe of your liver and it regenerates. So we have 2 or 3 dozen people a year in the United States who are giving a second organ as live donors. So I don't think it's my decision when someone should give an organ, by answering your question.
I want to ask that question again. You're advocating an experiment that you wouldn't advocate in the heart case. So, and then the question is, okay, is there a threshold under which you would no longer advocate for an experiment? When they're...
Yeah, I'm not advocating for a heart. I mean, so, 100% of death, I don't. Now, we have medical aid in dying in California, and there's medical aid in dying in some European places, and there are some experiments. I mean, one thing is people who have medical aid in dying sometimes want to give an organ, right? They're dying, they're ready to die, but they would like to save a life as well. And in some European countries, that's now been allowed, and I think it has happened once or twice in Canada. So there are ways to experiment with hearts too, but I wouldn't want to experiment with hearts for someone who wasn't dying.
Can I ask you one thing? It's not unconnected to this, which is just about the enforcement mechanism. So you said, I wouldn't, these are individual decisions, but assume, okay, I've gotten a benefit from the government, a deferred tax break, but I haven't given up my kidney yet. Should the government be able to come and take my kidney if
I'm not in favor of the government coming to take your kidney.
Okay, even though I signed an agreement?
That's a contract. In U.S. law, we mostly do liquidated damages. We don't do enforcement of contracts. We say, give the money back.
All right, so that would be your...
We do it.
This is a good strategy in any sort of discussion, debate, conversation, which is finding the line, right? We're trying to make intelligent distinctions here. Professor Satz, Dean Satz, she's trying to find exactly where her conversation partner's line is on the issue. Are you willing to experiment in kidneys or livers, hearts, and why? What's the basis? If you don't do this, if you don't kind of search through the argument and find where the true dividing line is, then you're not going to get anywhere. It's much more useful to do this than to talk past one another on a point that is at best peripheral.
Totally, yeah. And I appreciate how Dean Satz also prods him a little bit to get closer to the answer to the question that she feels like maybe they missed the first time around. And also, similarly, that he doesn't shut down her questions as examples of something that are too extreme or too unrealistic to discuss, but actually, as you said, uses that to make a point that turns out to be very much related to the crux of his argument.
In addition to the sort of asking part of the framework, I really appreciate how the way that she finds that line is giving an illustration of an intuition pump. What would you agree in this scenario about where this line is going to be? And that really helps, I think, Professor Roth develop his rationale for where he would draw the line.
Yeah, something I really appreciate here is just at a moment of confusion, you recognize that confusion, you kind of bring it up and you try to clarify something. I think that just within the framework, like you just mentioned, is really important without, it coming off as like you are disagreeing with me, or all you're really doing is just seeking further clarification.
I will say just one quick thing. Well, you're absolutely right. She does use a very helpful illustration. She's charitable in that she doesn't use an illustration that really inflames emotion. She doesn't use the worst case scenario. She doesn't say, think about, this poor person, being forced to give up their heart, to have money, to feed their family. She's not, kind of twisting the crux of the argument with that emotion. She's very charitable instead.
Yeah, I think that's similar to what we were just talking about with the Steelman argument as well. She's giving it the fairest shot that she can.
Agree with your point that there are benefits to the experiment that you're mentioning. I just wouldn't put the potential harm to the poor. I wouldn't discount it. There are a lot of ways we could save lives. We could take people, this is an old philosophy example, you walk into a doctor's office and, it turns out you're a match for 5 people who are dying upstairs, and all the doctor has to do is distribute your organs and 5 lives are saved. Well, we don't think you should do that. So we draw lines, and one of the things that these proposals do is they weaken a line that we tend to draw around the body and around not treating the body in certain ways. And you'll say, well, what about plasma? I actually think plasma is very different because it's renewable. And the thing about an organ is when you give it up, I guess you can get it transplanted back, but it's basically not renewable, and it's the way you think about things. Making a transaction that's reversible is quite different than making a transaction really where it's not reversible. And so if we could replace kidneys or grow them at, like we can replace our blood, I think it would be very different.
But we pay firefighters and soldiers and policemen, and they sometimes suffer irreversible harm. They can die in the line of duty. So we allow people to take risks for the common good, and we're prepared to pay them for it.
So we talked, you and I, a little bit about this. Yes, we do. And although there are limits to that, I actually, it's probably surprising in some ways, but I'm a big fan of, something like bringing back a draft as opposed to a volunteer army, precisely because I worry about creating a system where, the obligation to defend your country comes to fall on one group of people disproportionately and not everyone. And the minute you do these experiments, you're changing, the thing Titmuss was so, was so uppermost in his mind and maybe exaggerated. And again, I agree with you about the harm to the people who are dying. But the thing he was concerned about was moving from a system where everybody felt some civic obligation to give blood to one where it was only the poor supplying blood, and what that would mean about the society and the relations of people in the society. And I feel a little bit of that about the move from a draft to a volunteer army. So even though I accept that we often pay people to put their lives in danger,
what I appreciate most about that is how Dean Satz is just so crystal clear on what her moral paradigm is, that she is very much concerned about the distributional effects of whatever sort of market that they're creating. And that allows Professor Ross to really engage under her paradigm what is then the limit of sort of what we were talking about last time. And that, I think, was really good as a demonstration of good faith on Professor Ross' part of actually engaging with the substance and directly with what Dean Satz was talking about.
Right. She's setting the rules of the game, right? And she does this with another charitable technique, but also a useful one for an argument, which is laying out the conditions under which she would agree with her opponent, right? She's saying, I would be on your... She basically says, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she would be much more sympathetic to the opposing side, to supporting the donation of kidneys if they could regenerate, right? And she uses blood plasma as an example of a regenerative part of the body that she does support sales of. And this gives her opponent a fair shot to convince her, a fair shot. Now he understands under what circumstances she is persuadable.
Yeah, I think defining these lines of where both, ultimately stand and also to what extreme they're willing to go is really helpful in trying to meet in the middle and trying to find places where we both do agree. And I see eye to eye with you on that, while defining, where I'm not willing to go in terms of where I'm not willing to agree on.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said. I think her use of a counterexample brought up by her partner is really powerful, both to offer a point where her argument is a little more nuanced than we might expect. She says, I know this might come as a surprise, but here's an example that I feel differently about. And I think that's important also just to show the ability to hold arguments that might work differently in different contexts, but to still be stern on your main line of thought.
And it's much more difficult to move the goalposts of an argument once you've stuck them in the ground, right? Yeah, it's much more difficult to shift from your original position once you've made it clear.
Before we thank you and let you go, you have any general comments as you've been thinking about these particular videos, either about them or any other aspects of the conversations that you saw?
I think the importance of just underlining respect within conversations, and despite disagreeing with the constructive points of each person, seeing the humanity. I know this was brought up, but seeing the humanity of that person and the arguments that they have it is not them as a person. It's just simply an argument that they are conveying. And so I think just overall the respect within each of these conversations, I think was very notable for me.
I would say some good rules of engagement when it comes to argument, which argument is fun. Dissent in a free society is fun. It should be done more often, especially at this university. But I would say some good rules of engagement are, number one, always assume your, let's say opponent, that's a poor word, but always assume the person you're debating, you're discussing, has the best of intentions, that they're not malintentioned when they're disagreeing with you. Number two, always agree that they are exactly as passionate about the subject in the opposite way as you are. And number three, ask yourself while you're debating them, and bring this up, what if this point that they just made, what if that's correct, right? What if I granted them that position? Then how does my own thinking change? That'll make you a much more reflective and more adept debater in the long run, and a good conversationalist.
So thank you. Go ahead, Lexi.
I was just going to add one more simple point. I think this is something that Dean Satz did in a lot of the videos we've seen, but I really like her, as I mentioned before, her ability to anticipate how she believes her opponent is going to respond, and incorporate some of the beliefs that she knows them to hold in her own arguments. She's kind of already setting the stage for those first baseline disagreements to be played out.
And the last thing I'll say is that beyond the respect for others and intellectual curiosity that lead to the conditions for assuming good faith, I think a really essential thing is having the humility to understand that you might not be right. And quite frankly, that's not always our strongest suit at this university. And so more humility, I think, is what creates the conditions for that good faith.
What's interesting is in each of these conversations, the people on both sides have thought through these issues over a long period of time. So what's interesting is they're willing to show a degree of humility, even though they've probably gone through arguments like this and solidified their points of view.
Yeah, you're never so knowledgeable as to discard grace, right? Grace is always essential, no matter how much you know.
So thank you very much.